Police fired tear gas and water cannon in Causeway Bay as protesters blocked roads and attacked officers to oppose national security legislation. The security chief not ruling out raising the local terror threat level.
Welcome to TVB News. Protesters were back on the streets in Causeway Bay and Wan Chai this afternoon to oppose the national anthem bill and the proposed national security legislation for the city. Police fired tear gas and water cannon to disperse the crowd after protesters blocked roads and hurled objects at officers.
As Pinky Wong reports, at least 120 were arrested on suspicion of participating in an illegal assembly.
Hong Kong independence, the only way out, was one of the rallying cries today. It was the first street protest in the city since Beijing announced a few days ago its plan to directly impose national security legislation on the SAR. Pan-Democrats have described the move as an end to one country, two systems. Protesters began gathering in Causeway Bay at around noon. Pro-democracy activist Tam Tak-chi was handing out masks and hand sanitizers to people on the street when police intervened. Police then arrested Tam for allegedly organizing an unauthorized assembly and warned people around that they were violating social distancing orders. Pro-democracy activist Joshua Wong was also there.
We must stand up and fight and to let Beijing know that we will never surrender. And today, more than 1,000 Hong Kongers gather on street again is the proof that we will fight back.
As the crowd spread out along roads in the area, some set up makeshift barricades. Both sides were throwing objects at each other. Shortly afterwards, police fired volleys of tear gas along Hennessy Road and Percival Street. Similar scenes in Wan Chai. Officers were seen using pepper spray to disperse people on Marsh Road. Police armored vehicle was spotted near Taunaki Road. Some shops closed their doors amid the tense situation. The standoff continued with the police firing more volleys of tear gas and protesters running towards Causeway Bay. At around 3 p.m., police fired water cannon at those around Canal Road. Some had to be attended by paramedics. Meanwhile, objects were set alight on the road and police responded with more tear gas. The protests come 2 days after the central government submitted a draft decision on national security legislation in Hong Kong. The decision is expected to be passed by the National People's Congress on May 28th. Pinky Wong, TVB News.
Secretary Chief John Lee has expressed concerns over homegrown terrorist activities. Meanwhile, senior officials continue to voice their support for national security legislation in Hong Kong.
Secretary for Security John Lee warned on his blog today of potential terrorist acts in the city. He explained that since last year, dozens of explosives and guns often seen in overseas terrorist attacks were seized locally. He added the methods used were also similar, which indicates terrorism is a growing danger in Hong Kong and that national security is under threat. He noted Hong Kong's terrorism threat level is at medium, but the government is closely assessing the situation. Lee stressed as security chief, he fully supports the NPC's decision to establish a mechanism that protects national security. Chief Secretary Matthew Cheung and the Financial Secretary Paul Chan both agreed that the legislation is key to protect the lives and property of the people, as well as investors' sentiment. Meanwhile, the Justice Chief believes even with Hong Kong's high degree of autonomy, the central government has the final say on national security.
Vice Premier Han Zheng spoke with representatives from Hong Kong regarding Beijing's decision to legislate the national security law for the city.
Deputies from the SAR and former Chief Executive Leung Chun-ying have their own thoughts on the sensitive matter. Zheng Yaonie has the details.
More details are emerging from Beijing about its plan to introduce the national security law in Hong Kong. Today, Vice Premier Han Zheng, who's in charge of Hong Kong and Macau affairs, met with Hong Kong deputies to the National People's Congress in Beijing. Hong Kong Deputy Ma Fenghuo cited the Vice Premier when he said the national security law targets only a small group of people that carry out secession, violence, and illegal activities in Hong Kong, and those who collude with foreign powers. The legislation is to protect the rights and benefits of the vast majority of Hong Kongers. Another NPC delegate, Wang Yokshan, quoted Han saying the decision came after the central government's thorough consideration of Hong Kong and the country's long-term interests. He said the vice premier told Hong Kong deputies to promote and explain the legislation to Hong Kongers in ways that normal citizens can understand. The law's enforcement mechanism remains unclear, which has raised concerns. In response, former chief executive and vice chairman of the CPPCC's National Committee, Leung Chun-ying, said directions and details of the enforcement await further discussions. But he stressed the necessity for the city to plug legal loopholes. In the past 23 years since Hong Kong's handover, we have no legislation regarding national security, nor did we have law enforcement agencies. Many countries have stringent laws on national security, and they are enforced by the central or federal governments, Leung said. In terms of what actions would be deemed illegal, Leung said that needs to be discussed, but it was impossible to clarify every matter within the law. Dong Yaonie, TVB News.
Executive Councillor Regina Ip said given the situation over the past year, it is essential for Beijing to introduce national security legislation for Hong Kong. She also said the pro-establishment camp should be prepared to make sacrifices in elections later this year. Caleb Leung has details.
Back in 2003, the government made a failed attempt to introduce national security laws under Article 23 of the Basic Law. Regina Ip, who was then the Secretary for Security, believes the current political situation was worse than in 2003. She said it is essential for Beijing to introduce national security legislation for the territory.
Given its sensitive nature, probably there will never be an ideal time. On the other hand, in the light of events in the past year, clearly Hong Kong is facing very serious threats to the law and order of its society, as well as posing a serious threat to national security.
Ip noted a number of shortcomings of the city's current laws.
We don't have the offense of subversion, secession, and we don't have laws against local terrorism, and we don't have laws to prohibit infiltration by external forces.
She said the new law should also cover non-violent acts that threaten national security.
Nowadays, you can subvert a government through other means like cyber attacks, biochemical attacks, spread of fake information, disruption of financial order. There are many means. So I think we need to update our legislation.
It believes this piece of legislation may affect the upcoming Legislative Council election, and pro-establishment lawmakers should be prepared to make sacrifices if necessary. Caleb Leung, TVB News.
Foreign Minister Wang Yi also defended China in imposing national security legislation on Hong Kong, reassuring other countries that there is nothing to worry about. The top diplomat also asked the United States to stop smearing China. Caleb Leung has the details.
Speaking to the media today, Foreign Minister Wang Yi defended Beijing's decision to impose national security legislation on Hong Kong.
Through Article 23 of the Basic Law, the central government authorizes the Hong Kong SAR to fulfill its constitutional responsibility by enacting laws on its own. The authorization, however, does not prevent the central government from establishing a legal system and enforcement mechanisms for safeguarding national security in light of the actual situation and needs.
Wang reassured other countries that there is nothing to worry about.
The NPC decision targets a very narrow category of acts that seriously jeopardize national security and has no impact on Hong Kong's high degree of autonomy, the rights and freedoms of Hong Kong residents, or the legitimate rights and interests of foreign investors in Hong Kong.
The foreign minister also talked about the COVID-19 pandemic. He sent his sympathy and best wishes to the United States, which he said is the worst affected country. But he also mentioned that another virus is also spreading in the U.S.
It's most regrettable that while the coronavirus is still out there, a political virus is also spreading in the US and jumping at any opportunity to attack and slander China. I call on the US side to stop wasting precious time and stop costing people's lives.
Instead, Wang said the two countries should use the time to share their experiences in fighting the epidemic. Caleb Leung, TVB News.
Still ahead on tonight's news, a former Prime Minister of Papua New Guinea arrested in connection with corruption charges. Welcome back to TVB News. For the 10th straight day, Hong Kong did not record any new local COVID-19 infections, keeping the city's overall total at 1,065. Lo Chung-Mao, chief executive of the University of Hong Kong Shenzhen Hospital, thinks that Hong Kong should learn from the mainland. He noted Shenzhen has not had any local infections for 3 months, adding border controls are very strict. Lo added the mainland will only relax restrictions with Hong Kong only if the city's pandemic is under control. With classes about to resume in Hong Kong, he suggests teachers and students should undergo virus tests.
British Prime Minister Boris Johnson is resisting calls to sack his senior advisor for flouting the government's virus lockdown measures. Dominic Cummings has been criticised for travelling 400 kilometres to northern England when restrictions were already in place. Peter Vales tells us more.
Are you trying to polarise the debate?
The UK government is defending the actions of Dominic Cummings. The Prime Minister's senior advisor had driven from London to his parents' home in Durham, northeast England, with his wife and son at the end of March. That's an issue because the lockdown began on March 23rd. Restrictions stipulated people should remain at their primary residence, leaving only for essential local errands and exercise. Boris Johnson's office said Cummings made the trip because he wanted to ensure his 4-year-old son was looked after while he and his wife were ill. But critics of the government expressed outrage that Cummings had broken stringent rules. The government is defending Cummings and will not be letting him go. Cummings, who masterminded the 2016 campaign to leave the European Union, also dismissed any calls to step down.
Are you going to consider your position, Mr. Cummings?
Obviously not.
You're not going to consider resigning? The public are probably very angry.
Don't think so. You guys are probably about as right about that as you are about Brexit. Do you remember how right you all were about that?
The Daily Mirror later reported Cummings made a second trip from London during the lockdown and was spotted near Durham on April 19th, days after returning to London from his first trip. Cummings denied making a second trip during the lockdown. Elsewhere in Europe, Spain will reopen its borders to foreign tourists in July. The tourism industry represents 12% of the country's GDP and employs 2.6 million people. Spain receives more than 80 million visitors each year. The government also plans to declare 10 days of national mourning for the more than 28,000 Spaniards who have died from the pandemic. Around 200 demonstrators, including teachers and families with their children, gathered near the Education Ministry in Rome to demand the safe reopening of schools in September. Schools in Italy have been closed since March 5th due to a nationwide lockdown and are still awaiting instructions on how to reopen in September. Around 200 people in Frankfurt, Germany's financial center, protested outside of the European Central Bank against coronavirus restrictions. Although restrictions have been eased in the country, protesters argued their implementation was a violation of constitutional rights. Peter Caveos, TVB News.
The former Prime Minister of Papua New Guinea was arrested and taken in for questioning over corruption charges. Peter O'Neill was arrested Saturday after flying back from Brisbane, Australia, where he had been stranded because of COVID-19 lockdowns. He was released on bail and will spend 2 weeks in home isolation due to the same virus restrictions. Police are investigating O'Neill's involvement in the purchase of 2 power generators from Israel for about $14 million. O'Neill allegedly directed payments for their purchase without approval of Parliament and without a tender process. He had been the subject of an arrest warrant in Papua New Guinea since October on suspicion of official corruption, although officials did not disclose what he was wanted for. The 55-year-old led Papua New Guinea for 7 years before quitting in 2019 after a number of resignations from his government. That's the news. Thanks for watching.
Good night.